Yes, Orest Subtelny was an outstanding figure in Ukrainian historical studies. He wrote a landmark history of Ukraine at a key moment in the nation's history. Obviously, he could not foresee in the 80s, when he was completing his book in the late 80s, that the former Soviet Union would collapse. And that his book would be seized upon by an eager, hungry young generation looking for a new, alternative, but authoritative history of Ukraine. And Orest's contribution, I think, is manifold. The first, I think, is that he produced the first new synthetic history of Ukraine, probably since Hrushevsky. I mean, there had been Marxist historians in the 20s who had tried to do this. There had been historians from Western Ukraine who had tried to do this, etc. But he presented a history of Ukraine, the territory, not just the people, not focusing on West or East, but trying to synthesize all the various elements and integrate them into a new narrative, into a new coherent, balanced narrative that did not pander to any political group or party or affiliation within Ukraine or outside it. And his second, I think, contribution was that he showed us how it could be done, how it should be done. He brought new standards of writing Ukrainian history. I'm talking about the objectivity. I'm talking about trying to stand above the party fray, above allegiance to a region, and to try and get to grips with what this very complex history of the Ukrainians was all about. And I think what he produced was, in its day, remember, he did not have access to the types of archives that are now open to younger historians. What he produced, having the materials at his disposal at that time, was remarkable. And he produced a benchmark, a standard reference point to which other Ukrainian historians would then refer. We know that later Magocsi and Hrytsak and others produced important new histories of Ukraine. But his was the pioneering work. His work came at the end of the 80s when, as I said, there was this gap, there was this need to provide a coherent, comprehensive history of Ukraine. I remember as a historian of sorts myself and journalist, I was just writing a history of the Soviet nationalities problem, but often I had to speak about Ukrainian issues in Britain and later elsewhere. And it was difficult to come to come to grips with the more sensitive, the more troubling, the more complex elements of Ukrainian history. One had to rely on articles on Lysak, Rudnytsky, or somebody else, or Prytsak's early works, and gather them together. There would be a collection of articles that one would refer to, but there was no single volume. Hrushevsky, the classic standard work, is not outdated, but it didn't really serve the needs of a modern audience, of a modern generation that was dealing, as Subtelny has explained, with all the biases and prejudices that existed in Western learning vis-a-vis Ukrainian scholarship, regarding us as too nationalistic and somehow off the mainstream, not Russo-centric or Polono-centric enough, not really accepting our claim to our own history in the Hrushevsky, Lypynsky school, a tradition, I should say. Subtelny managed to both deal with that and to show Western peers that you could be detached and at the same time highly committed in writing this history. Because Orest, a Canadian citizen, but he was a Ukrainian patriot through and through, but not the balmy kind of Ukrainian patriot that, my country right or wrong, and I will keep silent about things that are inconvenient for me to mention. what was good about Subtelny's work was that he managed to produce the synthesis, the past, but also dealing with the tricky subject of what was then contemporary Ukraine, Soviet Ukraine, and also Western Ukraine in the interwar period. Highly sensitive issues, not only for readers under Soviet rule or living in Poland and Eastern Europe, but for the diaspora with its political fragmentation. So I was very happy when his book came out, because it provided us, it armed us with a weapon, not in an ideological sense, but in a scholarly sense, because not only is it written very capably, but it has the apparatus of learning, the footnotes, the references, the collected bibliography. He gathers in one thick tome everything you would need to know at that stage about Ukraine and to answer the questions that you had to be dealing with. And as I've mentioned before, it's obviously the book served as a springboard to others. But I remember in the early 90s, and I was then the director of the Ukrainian service of Radio Liberty, how appreciated it was in Ukraine, how young scholars were grabbing it and saying, wow, this is so refreshing, this is a new look. You know, to see Shukhevych and Bandera being described objectively alongside Skrypnyk and Khvylovy, and post-industrial Ukraine being described at the same time as we're talking about, you know, issues of nobilities in the 17th century. To have it all in one scheme, as it were, again, it hadn't really been done since Hrushevsky, and Hrushevsky obviously was writing at the beginning or in the early part of the 20th century. Again, I think it's important to remember the times in which he was writing. There were Ukrainian scholars in the West, Prytsak, Lysak, Rudnytsky, to mention just the outstanding historians, Omelijan and others. But Subtelny represented the new generation, the Western-educated generation, with the new Western education know-how, standards, sensitivities, sensitivities to caveats, almost looking around corners, preempting the kind of criticism that was leveled against the older generation Ukrainian diaspora historians. But somehow he was also prophetic in the sense that, without probably knowing it, that he was writing a history that was already pitched to a new audience awaiting the appearance of this book. And I must say that obviously we've come a long way since then, since the late 80s, and many other fine contributions have appeared that have broadened our understanding of Ukrainian history. But in my own particular case, perhaps this doesn't sound so humble. In the 90s, I was offered a contract with HarperCollins to write a history of Ukraine. But after rereading Subtelny, and then Magocsi's book had just appeared, I thought, no, I mean, you know, it could be a coffee table type of history of Ukraine, but what more at this stage do I have to add? There is already this solid book and books there. I'll move on to something else, and so I concentrated on very modern Ukraine. But it will be there as a classic. It's not without its faults. No book is perfect, but it's the best that we could have hoped for at that particular time. Well, remember, he was about 12 years older than me, so not quite a generation, but a significant difference in time. So as a scholar in England, I was reading his works, and I was particularly impressed by his work about the Mazepists. And I was aware that he had looked at Philip Orlik's relations with the Port, and that he had, in a sense, made sense for us of the whole Mazepa episode, crucial episode in Ukrainian history, a defining episode, if you want, and which has so many connections with our present time. So that was a very important book. Then I met him several times at various conferences and got to know him, and I was very influenced by him as a scholar. His sense of balance, his unemotive approach, meaning he was passionate, but he did not show it. He was very careful about observing all these sort of academic rules and niceties in his argumentation and his presentation. He didn't beat you over the head with his knowledge or his views. He tried to reason and to persuade you. So, as I think I've mentioned earlier, he showed us, the younger generation, how it could be done, how it should be done, how things could be presented, what kind of pitch we should be aiming for. I was trying to do this with others in the journalistic sense, in journalism, in the publicistic sense. But in the far more complex area of writing history, where you're open to immediate criticism from all around you, from within your own camp to those outside you, it's a very difficult task to tread through that minefield. I was aware, having been a scholar being a visiting fellow at Harvard in the early 90s or early 80s, that he had been there, and I know that perhaps deep down in his heart, he would have liked to have stayed on in Harvard, and perhaps the Harvard throne, as people used to describe it, Prytsak's seat, was really the main prize. That was the Kievan, in Kievan Rus, that was Prestol Kyivsky. But he didn't end up there, and to his credit, he didn't become discouraged. He kept on working and produced these great works. And I would like to say that perhaps others who have ended up teaching, which is not a criticism because they were involved in teaching and in writing and in organizing conferences and seminars and passing on that knowledge, he managed to do that, but also to produce these 6 books that I've heard he'd written, because I only know, I'm acquainted with 2 or 3 of his major ones. So that was important, that the fact that he was not all talk and not all eloquence, and didn't sort of evade the issue, well, where are the books, what have you produced? He actually produced the tomes that will be, his sort of memorials. I think also I remember him particularly when we had the World Congress of Sovietologists and Slavicists in Honolulu in late 88. I remember his sense of humor, his openness, his collegiality, his generosity. He was a very generous man with his time, with wanting to help, with the interest that he showed in others, and particularly to younger scholars. And when I I also met him once in 1990 in the first program that Soviet then television showed with a group of scholars from the diaspora, the first time ever that it had been done, with Ivan Dzюба chairing, and Prytsak was there, Shevelyov was there, I was fortunate to be invited, Marta Bolchevska-Khomya, but Orest was there, and I remember trying to pay tribute to him in a Soviet-Ukrainian context, to say this is what the man has done, because it wasn't so evident in 1990. People hadn't got hold of the book yet. It hadn't been translated at that stage, or was about to be translated. This was not 91 or 92. And so that also made an impression. His, almost quiet spokenness, and yet he had a lot he could have bragged or boasted about, but he was very subdued, and he preferred to talk about others rather than himself. And then in the 90s, when I was already working for the United Nations, I was at a seminar at University on refugee issues, and I remember staying at Orest's house and meeting his family. And again, the impression he made on me of a very supportive, generous individual who took a lot of time to show me around Toronto, to introduce me to people, not to act the busy professor, but to say, Bohdan, you're very welcome. And he made me feel that I belonged to a community of peers, among whom he was one of the outstanding ones. Obviously, the book has its very great merits in terms of the scholarship and the achievement of bringing it all together and making it watertight, hold water. But remember, when it appeared just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. So suddenly there was this great interest among all those who had written of Ukrainians and other non-Russians as not really important, superfluous to what was happening in Russian history or in Moscow. And so Subtelny's book appeared at a critical historical juncture. Just as the Soviet Union was collapsing, people wanted to know, well, who are these Ukrainians who have suddenly raised their heads? So obviously it was not enough to just read newspaper articles or journalistic think pieces. They wanted something more solid, and hence it became a relative bestseller in the West, and it was translated into many languages. And as I've mentioned, in Ukraine, because of the vacuum, histories aren't written overnight, and somebody wasn't going to just sit down and produce a model Ukrainian textbook in a year or two. It took many years. And is there one that matches Subtelny? I don't know. There are many good, capable works. But his was the standard reference point and the standard textbook, both in the West, in Western universities, not only in the diaspora, but in the key universities, and also in Ukrainian universities and learning. I don't think it legitimized, I think it popularized, and it clarified. I think the legitimacy work had already been done largely through the efforts of Harvard, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, all of that work that had been going on in the 80s, late 70s, and particularly in the 80s. It didn't justify, it gave academic respectability and credibility to Ukrainian studies. And so if you want, Orest's work was not simply the icing on the cake, but it was certainly a cherry on the cake. I don't think it was a clinical detachment. I think it wouldn't have been possible because he was passionate, but he kept it, shall we say, under control. And clearly he was writing from a Ukrainian perspective. So Magocsi's work is more a history of the territory and the groups, the national and ethnic groups who have settled it, synthesizing them into a common history. I think that, they complement and supplement one another, but I would say that one had to have had first the kind of history that Subtelny produced to get the second masterpiece that was produced by Paul Magocsi. Chicken or egg coming first? Which comes first? I would say that Subtelny's work coming in 88, 89, 90 was probably spot on, and that was needed for that audience there in Ukraine and for the diaspora. Later, we could have the luxury and the academic requirement of having a broader, less national or ethnocentrically based history. But remember what Subtelny was trying to do. He was trying to produce in a few hundred pages an entire history of Ukraine. Hrushevsky revisited right up, not up till the beginning of the 20th century, but with the highly complex 20th century tucked in as well, in a language and with the sophisticated methodologies that we had acquired by the end of the 20th century. I think that these issues were exaggerated. Don't forget that there were a great deal of sensitivities in the diaspora. There were also sensitivities about seats of learning held by respective scholars. We cannot idealize or romanticize the Ukrainian world of learning. There was a lot of competition, and still is, between Ukrainian scholars, which is natural. Academia is a rat race in its own way. We cannot think that in ivory towers, and especially ivory towers that have a commitment to causes, that these things don't happen. So I would say that probably, just answering your question again or recapitulating, yes, there was an element of exaggeration, politically motivated or motivated out of personality clashes or personal agendas that didn't coincide. But there's plenty of room for both of them, and both of them complement and supplement. They're two wings of the same bird of Ukrainian history. I think the influence is there, but not necessarily is it acknowledged or even understood. Look, 25 years have passed. Ukraine has been independent for 25 years. Many other people have tried to write histories of Ukraine or focused on aspects of it. And what is buried in all of that is the foundation that Subtelny, with others, but particularly Subtelny, managed to lay. If one digs deep enough, one will return to Subtelny, Hrushevsky and others, obviously, but Subtelny as the masterly historian of a new modern generation, one that combined the realities of Soviet and post-Soviet Ukraine with the realities of the learning and the discipline and the criteria of a Western approach to writing Ukrainian history. If Subtelny can be faulted, and none of us are perfect, Hrushevsky par excellence, then, the historians that are writing in Ukraine today are probably showing more bias or individual preferences than he did. I think that he did a very, very good job in extremely difficult conditions. And it's to his credit that he was prepared to go public with his history, knowing that it would invite criticism. You cannot satisfy everybody. And to stick with it, and to be a gentleman in the process, to be able to defend his views, to argue his views later on. And this foundation that he lay for us is his lasting testament. Talking to you at the moment from a place called Ferney-Voltaire, which is on the border with Geneva, and Voltaire used to live here. And I'm holding in my hand, as it happens, Voltaire's History of Charles XII, which he published in 1731. And it was, among others, notably Subtelny in his History of the Mazepists, that he reminded us that in 1731, Mazepa had written «L'Ukraine a toujours aspiré à être libre». And clearly through the works of Subtelny and others in the 20s, we wonder, who influenced Voltaire? How did he manage to get it right? And that mystery of whether he had connection with Orlik or his son, people that were of such great interest to Subtelny, persist. And that's why quite often I think of Orest when I'm walking in the streets of Ferney-Voltaire.